The costume department was supposed to be one of the safer places to work on any movie set. Away from the heavy equipment and dangerous stunts, it was where the creative magic of character transformation happened through fabric and design. But for Sarah Collins, a talented young costume designer trying to establish herself in Hollywood's male-dominated industry, her workplace had become a daily nightmare that was slowly destroying both her career and her spirit. What she didn't know was that her suffering had been noticed by someone who had the power and the will to make it stop. Permanently. Sarah had been working in Hollywood costume departments for 3 years, building a reputation as a meticulous professional with an eye for detail that directors appreciated. She had started as an assistant and worked her way up to designing costumes for supporting characters, dreaming of the day when she might be trusted with an entire production's wardrobe. Her work was consistently praised, her colleagues respected her talent, and her future in the industry seemed bright. The problem wasn't her work. It was David Kellman, an assistant producer, who had somehow decided that Sarah's professional success gave him the right to pursue her in ways that were becoming increasingly aggressive and inappropriate. What had started as unwelcome compliments about her appearance had escalated into physical contact that made Sarah's skin crawl, suggestions about private meetings to discuss her career advancement, and threats that her future in Hollywood depended on her willingness to be friendly with the right people. Sarah had tried every professional avenue available to address the situation. She had spoken to the head costume designer, who sympathetically suggested that Sarah should learn to manage difficult personalities as part of working in the entertainment industry. She had approached the production manager, who promised to look into the matter but somehow never found the time to follow up. She had even considered contacting the studio's personnel department, but other women had warned her that making such complaints often resulted in being quietly blacklisted from future projects. The harassment was affecting every aspect of Sarah's work. She found herself dreading each day, constantly looking over her shoulder and second-guessing every interaction with male colleagues. Her creativity was stifled by the constant stress, and she had begun making uncharacteristic mistakes that threatened the reputation she had worked so hard to build. Kellman, meanwhile, seemed to interpret Sarah's professional trapped situation as encouragement. He began showing up in the costume department at odd hours when she was working alone, cornering her in storage rooms and making increasingly explicit suggestions about what he expected in return for his protection of her career. When Sarah continued to reject his advances, his behavior shifted from predatory charm to barely concealed threats. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he told her one afternoon, standing too close while she tried to focus on alterations for the next day's filming. "I've been talking to some people about your work. There are questions about whether you're really cut out for this business. I could help put those concerns to rest, but you need to start being more cooperative." Sarah was trapped in the classic double bind that had destroyed countless women's careers in Hollywood. If she submitted to Kellman's demands, she would be compromising everything she believed in and opening herself to continued exploitation. If she continued to resist, she faced the real possibility of being pushed out of an industry she loved and had worked years to enter. Either way, Kellman won and Sarah lost. What Sarah didn't realize was that her situation had been observed and analyzed by someone who had very different ideas about how such problems should be resolved. Charles Bronson had been watching the dynamics in the costume department with the same careful attention he brought to studying every aspect of a production. He had noticed Sarah's obvious distress, Kellman's predatory behavior, and the complete failure of the production hierarchy to address a situation that was becoming more dangerous by the day. Charles had developed his own methods for gathering information about people who worked on his films. He made it a point to learn not just names and job functions, but also the personal situations and challenges faced by crew members. This wasn't idle curiosity. It was his way of identifying problems before they affected the production, and more importantly, of understanding who might need help that they were afraid to ask for directly. Through conversations with other crew members, Charles had learned that Sarah was a dedicated professional from a working-class family who had earned her position through talent and hard work rather than connections. He had also learned that Kelman had a reputation for similar behavior on previous productions, and that his continued employment seemed to depend more on his ability to schmooze executives than on any actual contribution to the filmmaking process. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening when most of the crew had wrapped for the day. Sarah was working late in the costume storage room preparing outfits for the next morning's early call time when Kelman appeared in the doorway. This time, however, his approach was different, more aggressive, more threatening, and clearly intended to force a resolution to what he saw as Sarah's unreasonable resistance to his advances. "I'm tired of playing games with you," he said, closing the door behind him and moving towards Sarah with obvious intent. "You're going to start showing some appreciation for everything I've done for you, or you're going to find out what happens to people who don't understand how this business works." Sarah backed away, looking for an escape route, but Kelman had positioned himself between her and the door. For the first time, she felt genuinely afraid that the harassment might escalate into something even worse. She was alone in a storage room with a man who clearly felt entitled to take whatever he wanted, and there was no one within hearing distance who might help her. That's when Charles Bronson appeared in the doorway. Later, Sarah would wonder how Charles had known to come to the costume storage room at that exact moment. She would never learn that Charles had made it his practice to walk through all areas of the production after hours, partly to familiarize himself with the workspace and partly to keep an eye on the safety and security of crew members who stayed late. He had seen Kelman heading toward the costume department with obvious purpose and had decided to investigate. What Charles saw when he opened the storage room door was a scene that required no explanation. A frightened young woman backed against a wall of hanging costumes, and a man whose body language and positioning made his intentions unmistakably clear. Charles's assessment of the situation was immediate, and his response was decisive. "Kelman," Charles said in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, "step away from her." Kelman spun around, his face showing surprise and annoyance at the interruption. "This is a private conversation, Bronson. Sarah and I are just discussing some career opportunities." "No," Charles said, stepping fully into the room. "You're cornering a woman who doesn't want your attention. That's not a conversation, it's harassment." Sarah later described the transformation that came over Charles in that moment. The polite, professional actor she had occasionally interacted with during fittings was replaced by someone whose physical presence seemed to fill the entire room. He didn't raise his voice or make any dramatic gestures, but something in his posture and expression made it clear that Kelman was now facing a very dangerous situation. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Kelman said, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Sarah and I have been discussing her future with the studio. This doesn't concern you." Charles moved closer, and Kelman instinctively stepped back. "Here's what's going to happen," Charles said, still speaking in that eerily quiet tone. "You're going to leave this room right now. You're going to stay away from Sarah for the rest of this production. And if I hear that you've approached her inappropriately again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation." "You can't threaten me," Kelman protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'll report this to the producers. You could be in serious trouble." Charles smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "David, let me explain something to you. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I know which producers hired you, why they hired you, and exactly how replaceable you are. More importantly, I know about your history with other women on other productions. So go ahead and make your report. Let's see who the studio decides to believe. Me, or someone who's been quietly settling harassment complaints for years. The accuracy of Charles's information clearly shocked Kelman, who hadn't realized that his pattern of behavior had been noticed and documented by someone with the connections to verify it. His face went pale as he realized that Charles wasn't just making empty threats. He had done his homework and was prepared to back up his words with evidence. "This isn't over," Kelman said weakly, but he was already moving toward the door. "Yes, it is," Charles replied. "And David, if you're thinking about taking this out on Sarah in some other way, remember that I'll be watching. I have friends throughout this industry who keep me informed about what happens to people I care about. Your career is a fragile thing. It would be a shame if something happened to damage it permanently." Kelman left without another word, and Sarah found herself alone with Charles trying to process what had just happened. The man who had just methodically dismantled her tormentor's confidence was now looking at her with genuine concern. His demeanor completely transformed from threatening to protective. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "Did he hurt you?" Sarah shook her head, still too overwhelmed to speak coherently. The relief of being rescued was mixed with embarrassment that someone else had had to solve a problem she felt she should have been able to handle herself. "This wasn't your fault," Charles said, seeming to read her thoughts. "Men like Kelman count on women feeling isolated and ashamed. That's how they get away with it for so long." Over the following weeks, Sarah watched in amazement as Charles' intervention produced exactly the results he had promised. Kelman not only stayed away from her, but his entire demeanor on the set changed from predatory confidence to nervous anxiety. He seemed constantly worried about being observed, and he began treating all female crew members with exaggerated professionalism that suggested he was afraid of any interaction that might be misinterpreted. More significantly, Sarah learned that Charles had been quietly spreading the word among key production personnel that Sarah Collins was a talented costume designer whose career should be supported and advanced. Suddenly, she found herself being consulted on important design decisions, invited to meetings she had previously been excluded from, and treated as a valued creative contributor rather than just another crew member. The head costume designer, who had previously dismissed Sarah's complaints, began praising her work publicly and recommending her for positions on other productions. The production manager, who had been too busy to address her harassment concerns, now made a point of checking in with her regularly to make sure she had everything she needed to do her job effectively. Charles never took credit for these changes, and he was careful never to make Sarah feel like she owed him anything for his intervention. Their professional interactions remained exactly as they had been before, with no suggestion that she was under any special obligation to him. If anything, he seemed to go out of his way to treat her exactly like every other crew member, thereby making it clear that her safety and respect were rights she deserved rather than favors he had granted. Sarah's career flourished in the months following Charles's intervention. Word spread throughout Hollywood that she was not only talented but also protected by influential people who cared about her success. This reputation opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed and created opportunities that advanced her career far more quickly than she had dared to hope. More importantly for her personal well-being, Sarah found that the constant stress and fear that had been poisoning her work life disappeared completely. She rediscovered her love for costume design, her creativity returned, and she began to enjoy going to work again. The confident, talented professional that Kelman's harassment had been slowly destroying was able to emerge and thrive. Kelman, meanwhile, found that his career trajectory had changed dramatically. While Charles never made any public accusations or formal complaints, word somehow spread throughout the industry that Kelman was someone who created problems on productions. His contracts began to be terminated early, his calls to executives went unreturned, and his opportunities gradually dried up. Within 2 years, he had left the entertainment industry entirely. Years later, Sarah would realize that Charles had accomplished something remarkable. He had not only stopped an immediate threat, but had also created a protective network around her that ensured similar problems wouldn't arise in the future. His intervention had been surgical in its precision, targeting only the perpetrator while strengthening the victim's position within the industry. The incident also revealed something important about Charles's character that went beyond his willingness to confront bullies. His follow-up actions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how Hollywood power structures worked and how they could be used to protect vulnerable people rather than exploit them. He had turned Sarah's isolation into connection, her vulnerability into strength, and her victimization into opportunity. When Sarah won her first Emmy Award for costume design 15 years later, she made sure to thank not just the obvious people who had helped her career, but also those who stood up for what was right when it mattered most. Charles was in the audience that night, and while she never mentioned him by name, their eyes met during her speech, and he nodded slightly in acknowledgement of what they both remembered. Today, Sarah Collins runs one of Hollywood's most successful costume design companies, and she has made it a point to hire and mentor young women entering the industry. She tells them that talent and hard work are essential, but that they should never have to endure harassment or compromise their dignity to succeed. When they ask her how she knows this is true, she tells them that sometimes when the system fails to protect you, individual people step forward to do what's right. She never tells them about Charles Bronson's intervention in that storage room, but she carries the lesson he taught her. That real strength isn't just about being able to defend yourself. It's about being willing to defend others who can't defend themselves. That lesson has guided her approach to business, to mentorship, and to life, making her not just a successful professional, but a force for positive change in an industry that desperately needs people willing to stand up for what's right. The storage room where Charles confronted Kelman was demolished years ago when the studio modernized its facilities. But the impact of what happened there continues to ripple through the lives of everyone it touched. Sarah's career success, the young women she has mentored, and the safer, more respectful working environment she has created all trace back to a moment when Charles Bronson decided that protecting the innocent was more important than avoiding conflict. For Charles, the incident represented everything he believed about the responsibility that comes with power and influence. He had been given advantages not for his own benefit, but to use them in service of justice and protection for those who needed it most. The cameras never recorded his most important performance that night, but Sarah Collins's life and career stand as testimony to his finest work as both an actor and a human being.